everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics Tyberius. Today we're going to be talking about once the foremost superpower of the world, or one of the two superpowers, is now a shadow of its former self. The question is, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is Russia on the road to returning to greatness, or is it dying in its cradle? We'll find out today. Roll the intro. Alright everyone, I goofed up that intro a little bit, but you know, it's me, and of course we're streaming and we're recording pretty late at night because, you know, that's just how things work. I was really behind on this one. I was hoping to have all this wrapped up, and I'm actually behind schedule on everything, which, I just suck, right? But that's what happens when you juggle everything that I'm doing. But, speaking of the juggling everything, there's a lot of people that have been able to help me to make it where it's rewarding and worth doing this at the same time as having another job and going to school. And I want to give those people a shout out. We have Fallenor, Andy Wagner, The West Dude, Julia, Ron Cleveland, Drew, Ace Man, Kamikaze, Samantha, Leah, Revolt Rise, and Shadow Fox. You guys have been absolutely great. One way or another, you guys have helped me, flourished me, what have you, and not only is the financial support, but also in the regards that you guys have actually been in the chat, you've been in the community, you've been engaged, and I really appreciate all that you guys have done. And I'm going to keep going. If you want your name, you want to help me out supporting this, you can help me out on Twitch. You can help me out on, on Twitch with donations and subs. There is a tip link down below that you can always hit out if you want to just use it straight through PayPal. And our Patreon is now active. If you want to give me about $3 a month just as a normal little thank you, that's totally doable. I'll get about $2.30 out of it, which means that, you know, half of the money that you would spend in Twitch through subs would just, you know, you wouldn't waste that and it would go to me, or it wouldn't just go to Twitch. So if you want to help me out that way, you can, or you can drop $10 a month on that little program to be a patron, where you automatically get the patron status. You get invited to my Discord, and you can participate in the community, help me develop topics, help me develop all the things. It's entirely up to you. You can be as involved or as least involved as you want, but if you want that opportunity, it is there for you at Patreon. Okay, without further ado, good to see you, Kamikaze, and we definitely appreciate that love. Geography. Russia. Mighty Russia. Well, it's not exactly looking good. Now, there's a few things that they could do better. There's a few things that they've done worse. Let's get into the nitty-gritty details here. The number one thing we're going to be talking about is geography, and of course, we're going to start with its climate. So, right display here. This is the Köppen map, the climate map of Russia, and you can tell that some of this just ain't very good. Now, if you can't translate this, there is a wonderful thing down below that actually tells you what that means. You might not be able to see that on mobile or whatnot, but if you're on desktop, you could probably see this. But what it largely is trying to show you is that there is two areas that is largely habitable within Russia. Those are the lighter blue areas, particularly the light blue, and the more turquoise, or not the turquoise, but the lighter blues. The lighter blues is more of a Mediterranean type climate. It is relatively warm. The lighter blue is, actually it's a little bit darker. Pardon me. The other one is a largely continental humid. And what that basically means is that the blue area, for being what it is actually has a climate very similar to Kansas. I thought Ukraine Russia is bigger. Okay, yeah. Anyway, the lighter blues there in the southern Russia is very more typical to Kansas. It's not too bad. It can get pretty goddamn hot in the summer, but overall, not a horrible place to live. Now, for anyone who is not aware, the southernmost part of Russia that you can see on that map, all of it is north of Chicago. So yeah, we're getting pretty high in the elevations here, but the reason why Europe is so much warmer than what you would expect in other places, in particularly even in Russia, is that while it is the same latitudes as Canada, is that most of these areas have a lot of heat that gets dumped into Europe from the mid-Atlantic current, which brings up a bunch of heat from the tropics and dumps it onto Europe. It's actually one of the reasons why the England keeps raining so often, and particularly northern Germany, is that it's actually a giant heat dump that's continually bringing more heat and more heat to northern Europe. Russia is the tail end of that. It starts getting colder as you go throughout the European continent. Once you get to Poland, it gets a little bit colder. Once you get to Belarus, even colder. But when you get to Russia, that's where it largely dies. You'll notice on that map, if you know the locations of the cities, is that St. Petersburg is right there at the edge of it, and Moscow isn't too far from it. Everything largely at that border, where it becomes more of a turquoise color, is largely places that have a tundra-like subarctic very kind of feel to it. This is not what you expect in Saskatchewan or Alberta, southern Saskatchewan and southern Alberta, as an example, is very much what like Moscow's like. You can live there, it's not horribly uncomfortable, but you're dealing with quite a bit of snow and rough weather during the winter months. But it's, pretty hot during the summer, you can grow quite a bit of crop, you're good. Once you pass that line, you're going up into areas that are very similar to northern Canada. That's like the Yukon and northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and the more the Canadian Shield is that it is a barren wasteland that is largely uninhabitable unless you really like suffering. And last I checked, most people really don't like suffering. So, without further ado, just in a general sense, the climate is that it's relatively okay if you're in the European heartland. But once you get out of the European heartland into the rest of Russia, it absolutely sucks. A lot of it's desert. A lot of it is these, what we would largely put as plains that look like Colorado and Utah, no, except without the mountains. And then you get into the far extremes, which is largely... You guys have heard the memes about Siberia. It is absolutely terrible. It is one of the coldest places on Earth. Siberia will actually set records for being colder than Antarctica. I'm sorry, I had a bit of a mental stroke there. But without further ado, bringing this back to where I'm at, is that the climate of Russia, there's a place where it's relatively good, and it's sizable enough that you've built out the modern infrastructure of what eventually became the Russian Empire. That's a good point. Kazakhstan says they're European. That's an interesting point that you make, and you're not wrong in that regard. I don't know about the Kazakhstan claim to being European, but what I do attribute to is that the lines between what is Europe and Asia are completely blurred. People will largely put it in as the Ural Mountains, and then once you get to Kazakhstan, you can just zip it over and keep Kazakhstan out. Largely, when it comes to this area, is that it's definitely the border ground, but this is where I just get into Eurasia, because Eurasia is more of its own continent. You guys are funny. Okay, anyway, getting back to where we're at and talking about the Russians and talking about their geography. Most of the Russian geography is problematic in a geopolitical perspective. It's got some bonuses in that it's large and it's expansive and it has access to an enormous amount of natural resources, whether it be oil, steel, aluminum, all these other things. Russia largely has the best geopolitical assortment as far as the holding of natural resources. They pretty much have everything outside of like rubber. The few things that they can't see within their own climate zones. But if it isn't that, they're good. They've got a pretty good agricultural base. They've got a pretty good industrial base. They've got a pretty good of everything that they just can access within a continental scale. The problem that Russia has is that it's not located in the best places. That one of the primary place where Russia currently gets its oil is within a place called the Yamal Peninsula, which is in that really dark green subarctic zone that I was saying. It's very much like getting all of your, it's very much similar to getting all of your oil out of Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, where, you have to go up to the northern slope of Alaska where it's freezing all the time and there's 3 months of constant light, 3 months of constant dark. Yeah, that's the same point. The exact same thing. That is very akin to the Yamal Peninsula in that regard. So anyway, in that regard, the problem is, compared it to like the United States or some other major powers, is that while the Russians technically have an enormous amount of resources within the border, they're not able to really tap in and access them because they're in Siberia. of all places. And there's a lot of speculation onto there's a lot of speculation into what actually could be in Siberia, because it's so remote that a lot of it largely isn't explored, but it's not, I don't remember the word, I think it's prospected, is that they haven't gone out, drilled holes in there, done underground seismic to know that if there's actually reserves in there regarding gold. Gold is highly suspected to be in there to a large degree. Some people wonder if there's natural gas in there. Very likely possible. Some people wonder if there's oil. A lot of things possibly could very much be within Siberia itself, and it's a massive area. It's like the size of Canada by itself, but you have to basically go in through the worst geography on the planet, or some of the worst on the planet, to actively get in and access that. And that requires a very highly technical and advanced society with an immense amount of capital to engage with that. And even during the mighty Soviet Union, they were only able to go so far and permeate into certain areas. So let's move on to the good here, right? A lot of it's bad, but some of it is good. When it comes to the climate zones that we talked about, is that is largely the Russian wheat belt and the agricultural zones. There's a lot of resources that are still had within that area. It's not as good as it used to be, but they, back during the days of the Soviet Union, you literally, in the southern Caucasus area, most of their oil was out of the Azerbaijan Baku region. Of course, that is now seceded to Azerbaijan itself, but is that they still have access into the Caspian Sea. They could be a part of that, and to some degree they are, in harvesting natural gas from the Caspian Sea, but works out pretty well. Just an overall point, Russia's geography is pretty bad. It's not horrible, but it's pretty bad. I'm going to throw up the maps for it right now to show you what I've largely been talking about regarding the ease of economic development. And here you go. If you're in the European corridor itself, it's actually pretty good. It gets semi-arid in some of these zones, and like one province there, I think it actually turned orange down there just south of Astrakhan. But it's not horrible. You get into the Don River Valley, you get in the Volga River Valley, you're doing pretty well for yourself, and you're set up to be in a really good situation geopolitically. Good places to build out industrial and agricultural infrastructure. You can move it on locomotion pretty easily because Russia is incredibly flat. It makes Kansas look hilly in some regards. That's not hyperbole, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But unfortunately, once you get out of that zone, you get into areas that are absolutely abhorrent. And just basically putting it straightforward, Eurasia's pretty bad. And once you get into the Asian side of Eurasia, is that most of the geography there is absolutely terrible. It's either too cold, too hilly, too mountainous, too arid, all of the above, and it gets to the point where most of these areas are actually hostile to human habitation. And when you're talking about people that live in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Afghanistan, particularly just any of the stands, you have to go, oh, hey, yeah, you guys are truckers. You guys deal pretty well with the things that you're fought with. But anyway, Eurasia kind of sucks, particularly when it gets into the Asian sphere of that, and that is largely out of the fact that its climate and its geography is really rough. And it rivals Africa in some regards is how bad it can be. But let's get back into Europe real quick, because I want to make one final note. If you go to Moscow and you look any direction within 1,000 miles, outside of running into a couple pieces of water, whether it be the Baltic Sea or the the White Sea, you're largely going to see flat land for every bit of 1,000 miles. Now, depending on which direction you want to go, it just gets so cold that no one lives there. But the problem with Russia geopolitically is that it has very poor lines of defense and actual borders. So right now, the current border between Russia and its western neighbors is largely just lines where the peoples largely had been able to settle out. And of course, right now we're seeing a massive fight between Russia and Ukraine on where that border should actually be, because there's a lot of people that are either Russified or Russian sympathetic in eastern Ukraine that would either like to go back to being part of Russia or, do not feel that they're Ukrainian at least. And so moving that forward, what I'm largely getting here is that the geopolitical problem with Russia is that it doesn't have any defensible borders that it can largely interact with. To get a natural geographic border, down south, is that you have to go all the way to the Caucasus Mountains, and this is down by Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. That is like, last I checked, it's over 2,000 miles away from Moscow. So the core of your area is only defensible by either basically places that would be subject to amphibious assault, like the Black Sea, which is a pretty good natural barrier. Not saying that in that regard, but it's either you run into water and you need an amphibious unit. Yes, you're absolutely correct, Chinchilla. It is. But anyway, what I'm getting at, going south, it's 2,000 miles plus to get to the Caucasus Mountains. To go east into Asia proper is that the only major border you have is the Ural Mountains, and they're actually smaller than the Appalachian Mountains here in the United States, so they're not huge. And the problem that I've also expressed many times with the Russians is that they probably shouldn't have gone further than that, because you get into a lot of land that's really hard to defend and also really hard to access, but also on top of that is that it's some of the worst land in Asia. So pull your boys home and you'd actually have a lot more of a geopolitically sound nation. Going north is that it's largely defensible out of sheer cold brutality. The only people that the Russians have to deal with to their north is the Finns. And that's not really much of something they can't handle. But going west has been the story of all of Russian history, is that they have had to deal with people to the west in one war after another, after another, after another. Now, granted, this could be southwest, this could be west, and this could be northwest, but basically in any kind of cardinal direction of west is that the Russians have had over 100 wars fighting all of these different peoples and being in coalition with all of these different peoples, and either subjugating people, destroying them, or trying to seek a geopolitical advantage over them. So, let's go down the list. They've always had to deal with the Ukrainians, although they largely have subjugated them since the Tsardom of Russia formed. I'm not getting into the history. You have the Baltic States, which has broken away repeatedly and come back into the fold a couple of times. Before that, you had the Swedes, you had that they were fighting with. You had the Poles under the PLC. You had the Turks under the Ottoman Empire. You've had the Germans a couple of times. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I'm not turning this into a history episode. The geopolitical problem with Russia is that they don't have a place where they can hunker down in and say, this is my land and this is your land, piss off. It literally is, they conquer the next place and then they find somebody else that wants to pick a fight with them. And they can go all the way to Paris before they finally start running into places that they actually hunker down into. And that's the problem with the Northern European plain. We've talked about that in other episodes regarding France and Germany. When we do a revisit, we'll absolutely be talking about that again, is that when it comes to this, is that in a nutshell, the problem with Russia is that when it comes to interacting with Europe, is that Europe basically is always going to be a cluster screw, with Russia being the anchor point on the far eastern end of it. And so the Russians have to deal with that, and they have significant geopolitical ramifications that fall out of that, whether it's the world wars or even today, where they see it themselves at the brunt end of the stick that is NATO. We'll see where that goes. But, we'll be talking a little bit about that essay. But anyway, moving on to the next section here is that we're going to be talking about its demography. Now, if you thought the Russian geography was horrible, just wait till you see their demography. And I hate to throw down Russia in this particular regard that we're doing it, but holy crap, Russia. I am so sorry. So, if anyone doesn't understand what you're looking at here, this is a population pyramid. You've seen this on my show many times before, but it's been a while since we've done this. But anyway, outside of what we had for the United States, the Russian demography is absolutely trash. You can see in the population 30 to 34, this is what people existed before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was largely, pretty healthy, had quite a bit of people. Anything after that is largely post-Soviet collapse, and you've noticed a 33% drop at minimum within its population birth rates, and at one point it had dropped to almost 50. So yeah, they were having a hell of a time. They've been able to rebound a little bit here and there, but unfortunately, because of the geopolitical events going on, is that they haven't been able to maintain that. We'll be talking about that more as we get into the economic. We'll be talking about this more when we get into the economic effects and the political effects, but we're not quite there yet. And you guys are already starting to beat me in chat. What the problem here is threefold. Russia is largely a state that is ethno-national, and that is largely, we'll talk about that in the political system, but that's what our Tsar Putin is largely pushing. Russia is for the Russians. The problem with maintaining an ethno nation, if you're going to do that, is that you need your country to actually be full of the ethnicity that you're trying to support. What we're not seeing here in this data, because it's not ethnically broken down, is that anywhere between a third and maybe as many as half of the younger births that are under the age of 25 in Russia right now are not Russian. They are people that do not identify as Russian, such as Tatars, Kazakhs, Ukrainians, any of the people that are still part of the disparate former Russian and Soviet Empire that still retain within the Russian borders don't identify as Russian, and they're a significant portion of the future population of Russia, which means that if Russia continues its ethno-nat policy, it will very likely balkanize yet again in my lifetime, to the point where we'll see a second collapse of Russia on ethnic lines that makes the former breakdown of the Soviet Union look kind of weak. Because I can guarantee you, just as in a few examples, you will see Dagestan become independent. You'll see Chechnya become independent. You'll see Ossetia become independent. You'll probably see Tartaria become independent. And that'd be huge, because Tartaria is one of the few places that the Russians never ethnically cleansed in its area in its escapade to become a dominant power in the region. And we'll talk about that in the history. We'll talk about that in the history subject. But the problem is that if Russia wants to hold on to this and not be an actual federation of a diverse groups of peoples under a Russian aegis, they're going to have to change their tone a lot really quickly. Okay, so one final note that I want to bring up, and you guys can see this again. You may notice that, males over the age of 30 are doing pretty good for a minute. And then all of a sudden, they're literally pulling half the numbers as the ladies. Now, usually you see a little bit of male mortality sinking in by the age of 40. That's pretty normal. But this takes it to an absurd degree. And the question is why? 3 reasons. 1, tuberculosis. The Russians have had a nasty habit with super tuberculosis ravaging havoc through the Russian people. And they've not been able to really put that down. But that largely hits both sexes. Another one that hits both sexes, but for some reason seems to be hitting males more in Russia, is AIDS. HIV and AIDS is absolutely ravaging Russia in a way that is quite scary with what's going on with them. Why they haven't been able to is largely because of systemic collapses within the former Soviet system that they have not been able to redress. And so, again, that's hurting them a lot. But the number one reason, and you may have all seen this coming, and it was definitely in chat, is alcoholism. A lot of Russian males were prone to alcoholism, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a lot of them are absolutely dying like dogs. The average age of the Russian the average age of the Russian male when he dies is 59. In the United States right now, it's 74, 75. So, in a nutshell, yes, you hit it. Absolutely, Chinchilla. Alcoholism is wrecking the male population within Russia, and we are talking about a society that is significantly more patriarchal than what we see in a lot of other Western societies, and it's been absolutely painful for them because they don't have the educated women to take the roles that these men are vacating, but also in the post-Soviet collapse is that they haven't been able to get their education system really reinvented into a modern constructive way outside of those for the wealthy. And so the average Russian doesn't have the technical expertise like they did during the Soviet era to maintain the weapon systems and the missiles and all the things that you need to have a highly proficient technological society. We'll hit this in the economics, we're going to hit this in the political, and we're going to hit this in the military aspect here in a second. So, let's roll on. The next part, economics, we'll tag at this. So you're going to see some new stuff in this particular slide and what's going on here. This is Russia's GDP. Now, the lower end bars is something that we saw when dealing with the United States, and that is GDP, NGDP and RGDP. The NGDP, obviously, is what was reported to the World Bank as far as how big this economy is, and according to 2020 numbers, it is a $1.5 trillion economy. If that sounds large, it really isn't. If it sounds small, it really is. This is smaller of an economy than Texas. Now, granted, Texas is pretty happening, but we're talking about an economy that is the scale of 140 million people, that has a continental in scope, and yet actually has, the last check, okay, that's a cheap shot. Texas is a beast. Hey, I'm sorry. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that for a U.S. state that has 30 million people, it is an absolutely massive state, is that Russia is significantly smaller and weaker regarding its actual numbers. Okay, now there's some key notes here that I want to hit at, and that is two. One is that these numbers can be a little bit misleading. Nanashi, actually, I'll reply to that a little bit later because this is a Russia thing, but I'll definitely hit that in the Q&A if you want to wait. And I would appreciate it if you did. Okay, so the numbers in the lines above is purchasing power parity. There is what the nominal and real as reported there, and I did the exact same thing for that as I adjusted for inflation. What that is that between currencies is that we evaluate almost everything in the United States dollar, but the United States dollar has significant differences in how it approaches its buying power because the United States put itself, let me change this over. The United States largely put itself at the dispense of the world commons, so anyone and everyone can use the dollar. It isn't metagame to the point where it can buy a lot more goods and, I was looking at chat there a little bit. The United States dollar is not metagamed to the point where it's really good at buying certain things and and selling other things. Most other currencies can get away with being metagamed to some degree, but the United States dollar can't. And so while we compare everything to the United States dollar, is that if you were talking about a nation who is metagaming to get the things that they want to need with their currency, they're able to get a lot more purchasing power in the response of, in the regards of how they can exchange for dollars. And so this particular graph, the top two is the adjusted for inflation and the real purchasing power. Now, I want to make a very clear statement here. Purchasing power parity is a bit of a gimmick. It's not that it's not right, but it's not that it's not wrong. And what I'm saying is this. It tries to account based on a number of certain items that you can buy anywhere, such as a gallon of milk or this or that, the comparative costs and how much you can buy between the United States dollar and, in this case, the Russian ruble. There's definitely some indications that the Russian ruble can get a lot more as a ruble than it can within the dollar within Russia. However, it does not mean that the reported numbers are absolutely they're really good. Because as an example, the problem that you have with purchasing power parity is that if you compare a gallon of milk in Russia to a gallon of milk in the United States, is that if you spend $1 worth in milk here and then however much that's supposed to be in rubles, is that you can still probably get more milk in Russia with that amount of rubles because of the fact that the Russian agricultural system is subsidized and metagamed to sell a shitload of milk. And so if that is one of your metrics, it can radically offset your numbers. And so I simply say to you, when you look at PPP, be very cautious of how that actually breaks down. I put it up there because of the fact that it is something to keep in concern in relative note, but it is not something that you want to go permanently based as. And so it's probably a little bit more in the middle between where Russia is in purchasing power versus what is reported as its normal GDP. Without further ado, so going back to where that is Russia is not doing very well, even with a PPP of $4 trillion, which is quite a jump from the 1.5, is that I'm probably going to assume that it's probably more to 2.5 to 3 trillion. This is still a relatively small economy that is not putting out major numbers from particularly a former superpower. But from that, even one of the top ranked world powers is that Italy has a bigger economy than this. Freaking Italy. And it's not to shit on the Italians, but they've always been one of the most economically disadvantaged nations that we've seen in Western Europe as a whole. And if you're once the former superpower, that hurts. Okay, that's a good shot. Come on, Russia, it's Italy. Yeah, anyway, so, yeah, shooting down on Italy. Russia isn't doing very well. We'll wrap this up again into... what did I just close? I might have closed the wrong thing, but we'll find out. Anyway, wrapping this up forward is that this is the average income per person in GDP per capita, and I also did the same thing for this as I did that. The average income per capita by the numbers is about $10,000 per person within the Russian Federation, which is really poor. Now, obviously, purchasing power is that this is claiming that it's over about 28,000 when it actually comes down to it. That's probably over the top by quite a margin. Now, granted, I might be a little subjected here, but anyway, going. Oh my God, Chad. Anyway, going forward here is that the average Russian probably has an average income level with purchasing power that is somewhere around $20,000 to $18,000 a year. It is relatively poor, and if you look at most of the economic conditions within Russia, they have really not escaped the post-Soviet collapse. In any major... they have not really made significant major changes within the Russian Federation that have really improved the quality of people's lives post-Soviet collapse. They've made some gains, don't get me wrong. They had a complete civilizational collapse, but in the overall scheme of things, they could be doing so much better. And I'm very sad that they're not. But that's where they're at. That's the institution where they're at. It is problematic. And so we'll be moving on. Economics is just in a general pretty crap. And that sucks for them, but they've just never been able to right that ship. And so moving to the next part here is that we'll be talking about the political situation. Now, this is a mess, but we'll suffice it to say this. Russia maintains to be a contributing member of the democratic nations of the world. Everyone is very skeptical of this. When they have elections, they see movements in those elections, but it's nothing that makes sense. The ruling party, Unity Russia, has basically been in charge since the end of the Soviet Union to a large degree, and consistently with the rise of a Vladimir Putin, is that every time Putin wins, even if there's economic strife, even when there is a major political scandal, is that when even we in the Western world hear about what is going on in Russia, is that we don't see the inevitable political flip that we see in almost every major Western nation with an active, functional democracy. Is that we have yet to see Unity Russia win or lose an election when they absolutely probably should, particularly after the Crimean invasion and the subsequent economic downturn that was responded to that. Okay, moving forward in that, is that even with the skepticism aside, is that Russia politically is kind of broken. It tried to transition into a relative stable democracy. It's largely failed in that regard, and even if it was an actual democracy, Putin largely controls so much power to the point where he's basically a despot anyway. So, if you're looking for functional political systems, this is not necessarily it. And to show you what kind of people that we're talking about here, most of the allegiance that is between Putin and what's going on in the Russian oligarchy is either very rich people, which granted is pretty normal, but more importantly, most of these people are former Soviet spies and espionage officers. And then basically what happened is that the former intelligence networks for the Soviet Union became the ruling class of the country because they knew everybody's dirty laundry, all their dirty secrets, and when they weren't employed anymore by the vast Soviet government, basically the KGB officers became politicians. Except they didn't play politics, they played extortion. And a lot of these people either became part of the criminal underground of the Red Mob or got involved with politics. It's weird. It's like, these people actually get along. Anyway, I largely agree with that. Putin is a bit of a relic in the regard that he wants to return Russia to its former glory. He actively has brought back the Soviet national anthem. He wants to largely return Russia to what it was under the Soviet Union, because that was his memorial days, his heydays. He became a major. He grew up in the in the 70s when it looked like the Soviets were going to win. He remembers the times when the Soviet looked strong and powerful and was relatively stable. And you know what? For what it is that a lot of people in the Soviet Union, or if you will, in Russia, pre or post Soviet collapse, is that those who remember the Soviet days largely remember an era of strength and stability and relative, not, what's the word I'm looking for here? Strength, stability, and relative security. But as that went on, that became less so. And you might think, oh, well, don't they remember the breadlines of the late 80s and the collapse of the Soviet Union? They do. But everything that happened after that has largely been worse. Getting a increased standard of living has been absolutely hard for the Russian people, and they've made very little, they've made very little in the way of actively growing economically in major ways that has improved the lives of the average Russian citizen. On top of that is that the political instability, insecurity, and distrust that has been built out is that largely what we're looking at here, is that a lot of Russians over the age of about 40 largely would like to return to the Soviet Union in a lot of regards because, or actually, no, we'll not put it this way. I'll reword it this way. They miss a lot of what the Soviet Union was, and they're very authoritarian people in their mindset. Is that they miss the order, they miss the security, and they miss the strength of being a part of a major powerful nation, and they are pushing the majority of what Unity Russia actually is, which is, instead of being a far-left communistic hellscape, is that it's almost a far-right fascist hellscape. They actively don't really care too much about Putin, cracking down on dissent and doing a lot of these things that we would find unethical, because he is doing the things that a lot of people thought made the Soviet Union great. They're just trying a few different things because the economic doctrine didn't work. And so, anyway, at least where we're going with this is that politically, the Russians are in a mess, and not having any kind of political coalition in a semi-functional democracy, they're getting the worst of both a dictatorship and a democracy. Their phony democracy does not give them the benefits of having a dictatorship in the regards that they can't just go about and systematically change everything. But on the other side of that is that they're not getting the benefits of actually having a democracy because the leadership doesn't have to answer the people and get voted out of office. And so, politically, Russia's screwed. Okay. Final point here is the military. The Russian military is still kind of kiting off a lot of its power that had built up during the Soviet Union in the regards of a lot of these development plans. As an example, the people who built the tanks, or I know a lot about their air forces, Sukhoy, Mikoyan, Tupolev. Give me a second. There's a whole plethora of these folks, right? Is that these are the former state agencies that became professional companies that have been able to build out a world-class arms industry. They're still operating to a large degree. However, it's been a really hard time for them. And there's two ways where this goes. Number one, they have still been active and effective, and they are the largest anti-Western arms supplier out there. Only the Chinese rivals them in any kind of major way, and that's largely because the Chinese copy what they do, even to this day. If you're looking for the vast majority of planes, tanks, and planes, ships, and aircraft that are not Western built, it's still a lot of the former Russian weapons agencies and companies that are building these things, designing these things, and then somebody else eventually buys them or copies them. And you can find this from the Yeltsin-class submarine or the Borai. We can talk about the Su-27, the Su-37, the Su-57, all of these different military arms programs, or the T-14 Armada. Granted, the Russians get first pick on what all these weapon systems and what they can use, but they have either sold technical aspects to people like China, India, and a whole other nine yards, export models of like the T-90MS, or that everyone's on the docket to get it very soon, such as the T-14 Armada, because the Russian government is no longer paying for nearly as many as they were supposed to, that they're actually going to export various versions of that tank to foreign suppliers to keep these companies up online. And so, if you are within the East, or if you will, the former powers, is that Anti-rocket ship has hype for Russia. Oh, okay, yeah, good point there. The Russians have been trying to update their weapon systems in regard to stay competitive with Westerners. And the S-400 is a really good example of this. Okay, so if anyone doesn't know what the S-400 is, it is an anti-air missile. And it's got better stats than the Western one does. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's pretty questionable because the Russians have always been behind when it comes to accuracy. Their missiles never have been as accurate. That's true. Is the S-400 as accurate as something like the Patriot D4? No, it's technically not, but it is. Because this has not been an accuracy revolution, it's been a methodology revolution regarding the S-400. And a lot of people were theorizing if you could do this, so I'm going to talk about this weapon system real quick. Generally, what happens with most anti-aircraft weapons, particularly anti-aircraft missiles like the Patriot, is that it flies off, it gets really close to the jet. If it doesn't impact itself and explode right next to the thing, it will try to explode as very close as possible with a proximity fuse. And so, at minimum, it'll spray shrapnel into your engine components or into your avionics platforms, or it will actually, the concussion of the blast might rip off a wing. And so, even if you don't hit physically, is that it'll be able to knock your weapons platform, your aircraft offline. And you got to bail out and get all of that. The S-400 took a new genesis on how to work this, okay? Now, basically, what the S-400 has done is that it turns itself into an anti-air, or basically a flying shotgun. Is that somebody had the idea that you would take basically ball bearings and turn this into I can't remember what this is. There's a word for this, I forget what it is, but basically you turn this thing into a flying claymore, right? It's easier to get in the path of something than it is to actually hit it. So what the S-400 is designed to do is that it is able to track the target, the intended flight path that it is. It flies up to the interception path, or at least it flies to the point where when the warhead goes off, the jet should be in front of the warhead. And what it does is that it's full of things like shrapnel, ball bearings, that kind of thing. And it just sprays the living shit out of everything in front of it. While you're not physically hitting the target with the missile or getting as close as what you would for like the Patriot, it's actually been remotely or significantly more effective because it gets it gets the damage dealing parts of these ball bearings and the shrapnel to the point where it can actually become an intercept weapon. It does the work, bam, you're good. It's not necessarily a Russian innovation, but they've been the ones to successfully do it first, and there's a reason. This idea came out of the West a long time ago, but the West has not been able to do that as much. And the reason why is that the Western missiles tend to be a lot smaller and nimbler. If you look at the Patriot versus the S-400, the S-400 is like twice the size. And that's not only just in the size of... It's not taller twice the size, but it's like significantly wider. And it carries a lot more mass. And the reason why is the American ones usually tend to be actually a little bit slower and have a lot more of a guideline or a flying guide timeline. And they tend to be more efficient with its use, and they usually could cruise and maneuver better. The Russian ones were always bigger and faster and have more range. And so what they've largely done is they've kind of just smacked it out of the park with getting the weapons platform to largely be faster, quicker, not necessarily more agile, but more accurate in regards to that innovation, so that the S-400 is actually more competitive with the Patriot 4D than any other weapon system right now, because they've innovated that. And so, yes, I agree with the chat comment right there. The Russians are doing pretty well with that weapons platform, and they should be commended. Okay, cool. Wrapping this up is that there was a question there, and I need to see if I can find it again. I don't remember. But anyway, the Russian military is in a serious level of hurt. We don't know exactly what the standing army is. There's been reports that it's still somewhere around 700,000, according to the Russians, like 750,000. So 750,000 men in uniform. But from everything that we can see regarding troop deployments, movement or aspect deployments, and actual salaries and all that the espionage units can work, it looks like the Russian army, by everything that we see demographically and whatnot, is that it's probably something more like 450,000. So less than half of 1 million men in armed service, in armed uniform. That can be a good thing and a bad thing. And so we're not quite sure what the quality of Russian armed forces is. They were absolutely trying to transition into something that was a lot more modern and looked a lot more like the American and Western forces, where instead of having the vast, ginormous thing of the Red Army ready to roll tanks, tank after tank after tank, into their enemies, is that now they are starting back in the early 2000s, or not 2000s, the early 2010s and the late 2000s, is that they were working on making their forces a lot smaller, a lot more nimble, and a lot more active. Very similar to what the United States did after Vietnam. They looked like they were getting about a third of the way through that transition process when they lost all of their funding due to the 2014 sanctions and invading Crimea. And so, while they do have new weapon systems that would facilitate this kind of doctrine, such as the T-90MS, which was updated for that standard. You had the T-14, the Su-37. A lot of these things, a lot of these things that would culminate into being a world-class fighting force on a budget with more military support, is that we don't know if they've made that transition. The last time they were engaged in our military conflict was in Georgia in 2008. In any kind of protracted measure, they performed competently, but it was largely due to the fact that they completely outnumbered their opponents. A lot of the Russian forces that we've seen within Ukraine was a lot more of a shadow war, and it wasn't a traditional military engagement because Ukraine really hasn't been able to reply in any willing kind. We do know that Spetsnaz forces are operating with insurgents in the Donetsk region, but this is more of that shadowy intelligence matter of affair, not an open, sustained military conflict between two professional armed units. And so, in a nutshell, Russia is militarily probably not doing very well, but we will not see definitively until they engage again in a major protracted military engagement against another armed military, and we just don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. All right. That was related to the United States education. I'm going to hit that in the Q&A after this, but we'll definitely hit that. Thoughts on Eurasianism? I don't know what that is. Shadow might be the way forward, especially if your analysis is correct. Well, actually, that's one of the few things that we do know definitively. The Russians, because they were run by foreign intelligence agents, have not mitigated their foreign intelligence. They have not mitigated on their foreign intelligence apparatus and what they're doing. They continually fund the SVR and the domestic security forces to do basically all the force multiplier for work that they've been able to do. And all of the thing about Russian hacking and Russian intelligence gathering and all this shit, a lot of it's true to some degree. The Russians have been playing hardball with anything and everything that largely comes into shadow warfare. And they're pretty good at it. The problem is that in every other traditional means, they're falling behind because they're not funding it, or they don't have the manpower or the skills base to continue pushing that forward. And with the collapse of the Russian education system, the collapse of the Russian demography, we're very likely to see a Russia that becomes even less advanced, less technically proficient, and more of a technological backwater in what we've seen for most of Russian history for the better part of the last 600 years. So, superpower return, probably not likely to happen. If anything, we're going to see Russia become a backwater again, and the final frontier when it comes to the European East. And with that pretty much lapped up, we'll largely see with the future of Russia is that it doesn't look good, and I expect that at some point in my lifetime, we'll see another round of balkanization in Russia to where certain provinces within the far extremities will be able to secede or rebel successfully. And you may even see the formation of Tartaria, which, holy crap. Of course, the Russians may throw nukes at Tartaria, but that's a whole other conversation. Will Tsarist Russian return? Not likely. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to wrap up Russia with this. We'll be talking about in the next episode, or at least with the next Russian episode, the history of Russia, the rise of Russia from the Principality or the Duchy of Muscovy, all the way up to the Tsardom of Russia, the rise of the Russian Empire. We'll talk about the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about where it is today, and then talk about again. So anyway, I could not tell you on Russian bonds. That's not my specialty. I'm just looking at Russia overall. Geopolitically, it's in a disaster, and it's only going to get worse. Yeah, we're going to move this off to the Q&A, but I've been Tyberius D. Thank you very much for watching. The outro will be about 20 seconds, and then I'll do the Q&A. So, catch you guys next time.